Hey everybody, this is Steve. Are you curious about what your visual, auditory, kinesthetic learning style is and how that can help you? Well, don't bother. Okay, that's it. That's video done. Now in this video, I'm going to be explaining why a lot of people think that diagnosing your learning style as visual, auditory or kinesthetic, why they think it's useful. I'm also going to explain why it actually isn't really that useful. I'm going to explain why believing your visual, auditory, kinesthetic diagnosis is actually a limiting belief. And stick around to the end, because what I'm also going to be explaining is, if that's not particularly useful, what is? But why listen to me on this topic anyway? Well, the whole idea of visual, auditory, kinesthetic learning styles is really a crossover from Neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP. Now, I'm an advanced master practitioner and trainer of NLP. I've been involved with that field for nearly 20 years. I've done tons of training in my time with some of the greatest trainers in the world, and I've seen many times how these ideas get distorted and misapplied. And by the way, if this is the kind of content that interests you, or if you're a professional person who is looking for ideas around having a happier and more successful experience of your life and work, then please subscribe to this channel and don't forget to click the notifications bell. So what are visual, auditory, kinesthetic learning styles, and why do people think it's useful to diagnose that? We have visual, auditory, kinesthetic, i.e. feeling, and also olfactory, which is smell, and gustatory, which is taste, sensory systems. When we are doing cognitive tasks, when we're thinking, when we're learning, when we're making decisions, we're using those faculties. We're using our ability to make pictures in our minds, to hear sounds, to have internal dialogue and comment on things, to have feelings in response to those things. And the key thing is, we have all of those sensory faculties. We have all those thinking capabilities, and we use all of them. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we've developed them in equal quantities. It may well be that we've exercised our visual faculties more than we've exercised our auditory faculties, for example. And we shouldn't be surprised if somebody who is an artistic painter has developed a particularly acute visual capability because of what they do and because of what they're exercising all the time. They will also probably have developed a very strong visual kinesthetic overlap. We shouldn't be surprised if a musician has developed a particularly acute auditory faculty and a particularly acute audio kinesthetic pairing. We shouldn't be surprised if somebody who practices logic has a particularly strong auditory digital faculty. That's the self-talk, because people who do logic do a lot of verbal reasoning in their heads. And that's really no different to the fact that some people might have developed their arms more than their legs, or developed their shoulders more than their hips. And so this lends itself to the idea of a preferred representation system. But that shouldn't change the fact, though, that we do use all of them. Even if we have a preferred one or two, ultimately we still use all of them. Now, visual, auditory, kinesthetic learning styles is sort of that preferred representation system idea, but applied to learning. So the idea is that if you have a particularly strong visual capability, and therefore you can do more with your visual capability, the idea is you are a visual learner, and therefore you learn best when you learn with visual cues. Similarly, if you have a auditory preference, the idea is that you will learn best using auditory cues. Now, while there's some validity to that, and there's also an argument to say, use your strengths rather than suffer your weaknesses. So if you have a strength for the visual capability, or you've developed learning strategies which use the visual capability as a dominant factor, then the idea is utilize that strength. But this whole thing has led to some limiting ideas. It's led to the idea that some people put forward, which is that you should take the visual kids and separate them from the auditory kids, and you should teach the visual kids visually, and you should teach the auditory kids auditory. Look, only do that if you seriously want to limit their potential. So here's why it's not necessarily that useful to diagnose a visual, auditory, kinesthetic learning style. Mental tasks are never completed inside just one representation system. If you think about lifting a box is not an arms or a legs or a back activity. It's an arms and a legs and a back activity. And most mental strategies, in a similar way, they're not visual or auditory or kinesthetic. They're visual and auditory and kinesthetic. I mean, just think what would happen if you tried to lift a box with just arms, or with just back, or with just legs. It wouldn't work. So here's why believing a static visual, auditory, kinesthetic diagnosis could be a limiting belief. I see this happen all the time, and it's sad. I see people who go around, they've hypnotized themselves into thinking, I am a visual learner, and that means I cannot do things that require auditory learning, and I cannot do things that require kinesthetic learning. It limits what people can do. It limits what people think they can do. But also, if you engaged only in visual learning activities because you've diagnosed yourself as a visual learner, what you are not then learning is how to orchestrate all of your faculties. You're learning to strengthen only one. It's like being somebody who has stronger arms and therefore only develop their arms. So what's better than diagnosing a static visual, auditory, kinesthetic learning style? Well, it is to stretch all of your faculties, and it is to stretch the ways you can use them in combination. Let me tell you about one of my learning strategies. And by the way, there's a clue there too. I said one of my learning strategies. Most people don't just have one. Most people have learned several learning strategies. Now, one of mine is if I'm learning a complex system, I like to start with a flow diagram. Now, that already starts to imply that there's a visual entry point there. But what you'll see me do is you'll see me trace the flow diagram with my fingers, and you'll see my lips move because I'm talking myself through the picture. So I've got a visual input being translated into auditory language. So that's visual overlapping to auditory. And then every so often you'll see me stop and you'll see me look into the distance. What I'm doing there is I'm taking the static picture and the auditory information, the auditory digital information, the self-talk that I've used to explain this to myself, I'm translating that into an imaginary 3D moving system. So this is where I'm doing visual, but whereas this is visual external, this is visual internal, this is using my imagination. And then what I will do is I will test how I feel about that, my kinesthetic response, to see if my kinesthetic response is telling me that I've modeled it correctly. So that's a learning strategy that goes visual, auditory internal dialogue, visual imagined, and kinesthetic test. So out of all that, which learning style would you say I am? So what's better than having a static diagnosis is knowing what set of learning strategies you've learned to be strong with, what those strategies are, and the context in which they're most useful. But what's also better than just falling for a static diagnosis is the idea that, look, if we're using our representation systems together to achieve tasks, then why don't we stretch all of them? You know, if I have a particularly strong visual but a weak auditory, why don't I develop the auditory? And why don't I stretch the number of combinations in which I know how to use these things? Why don't I stretch my ability to use visual and auditory together, or auditory and kinesthetic together? And do you know what this points at? It points at the usefulness of physical and artistic activities as well as science activities, because nothing develops the visual, auditory, kinesthetic faculties working together than something like reading and playing music. Nothing stretches the visual kinesthetic pairing better than a visual activity that has a feeling response, like art. So whilst a lot of people say, rather myopically in my opinion, that artistic subjects are not high value, yes they are, because they're stretching those faculties. And if you have stronger faculties and stronger ways to use them in combination, you will be able to learn more things. You'll be able to solve more problems. Now, if this video is interesting to you, please hit the like button, please share it with your friends. Please also tell me your experiences around this in the comments, and I will try to reply to them as much as I can. But most of all, please, if this is content that you like, if you like more content like it, if you're a professional person who is trying to build a happier and more successful experience of their life and work, please subscribe and hit that notifications bell.